We've all seen the movie Tombstone, right? Or at the very least, you've probably heard about Wyatt Earp and his feud with the Clantons. But where exactly did the Clantons originate? And is it true that the family patriarch Newman Clanton was really the meanest of the bunch? Well, today we'll be discussing just that. We'll trace Old Man Clanton from Tennessee all the way to Texas. We'll talk about his association with other outlaws like Curly Bill Brocious, and we'll examine his untimely, yet extremely violent demise just 2.5 months prior to the gunfight at the OK Corral. And yes, we'll also discuss whether or not the Cowboys of Tombstone really wore those red sashes like you see in the movie. And stick around to the end because I'll also be answering a few questions and comments from the audience. Everything from what happened to Billy the Kid's guns after his death, to how the Oklahoma Panhandle came into existence, the history of Fort Worth, and I'll even address what in the hell happened to the intro music. My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza.
Yeehaw!
Newman Haynes Clanton was born in Davidson County, Tennessee, sometime around the year 1816. And per usual, there's really not a lot of information about his early life. We do know that at some point he moved to Missouri, and that by 1840, he was married to a Miss Mariah Kelso. The pair began raising a family right there in Callaway County, and it's there they'd remain for about the next decade. The family would migrate to Illinois for a spell in 1851, and then just a couple years later is when they finally settled near Dallas, Texas. Now, Newman enlisted in the Confederate Army at the onslaught of the war, but it does appear as if his service was relatively short-lived. He spent a brief period with the 1st Texas Artillery before joining the Home Guard and then mustering out in 1862. Like I said, he really didn't serve all that long, and he never saw any action outside of Texas. However, interestingly enough, at least one of his muster rolls hints at him possibly having at least one clash with the indigenous. And yeah, following the war's end, he and his family headed west to Port Hueneme, California, about halfway between Santa Monica and Santa Barbara. This was not Newman's first time in California, by the way. He did make a short trip west, I believe in 1850, but so far as I know, he never struck it rich. And this most recent venture proved just as fruitless. Not only did his wife Mariah pass away en route, but no sooner had Clanton arrived there in California than he got himself involved in a little dust-up known as the Hueneme War, a bloodless land dispute that pitted him and several other squatters against a powerful railroad magnate by the name of Thomas Scott. Thankfully, no shots were fired, and by the early 1870s is when the family finally packed up and headed east to Arizona. Now, the Clantons initially established a ranch on the Gila River, and this was a legitimate ranch, at least at first. They had their own herd of cattle, they dug irrigation ditches, even cultivated about 100 acres worth of crops. Only thing is, Newman, or Old Man Clanton, as he came to be known there in Arizona, apparently wasn't above operating outside of the law. And that being the case, it wasn't long before he began working with the notorious John Kinney, or as we like to refer to him here on the Wild West Extravaganza, Kinney, you bastard. And if you're not familiar with John Kinney, he was a pretty well-known stock thief over in New Mexico. Had his own gang, oftentimes referred to as the Boys, which included such luminaries as Pony Deal, Curly Bill Brocious, and for a very brief period of time, a young man going by the alias of William H. Bonney. These guys would steal horses and cattle from as far away as Texas, and then use their affiliated ranches, like the one owned by Clanton, to sort of launder the livestock. And according to historian John Bosennecker, Old Man Clanton and his sons were indeed a, quote, important link in the chain, trafficking in stolen horses and cattle between southern Arizona and the Texas Panhandle. Finally, in 1878 is when the Clantons moved further south to the San Pedro River, not too far away from what would soon become the notorious boomtown of Tombstone. Now, by this point, most of Newman's children were already fully grown. There were 6 all total, but his oldest boy and his daughters, they stayed behind in California. You might want to double check me on that, but by the late 1870s, it does appear to have just been Newman and his remaining 3 sons, Ike, Phineas, and Billy. That's also about the same time they began associating with a group of hardened desperados known as the Cochise County Cowboys, pretty much doing the same type of stuff they were engaged in further north with John Kinney. Only difference is, by 1880, they were doing most of their stealing south of the border, especially after silver was discovered over in Tombstone. Not only did the Clantons have a seemingly endless supply of, air quotes, free cattle down there in Norte Mexico, but they also had one hell of a market in Tombstone with all the hungry prospectors. Now, contrary to popular belief, neither the Clantons nor the Cowboys were a formal criminal organization like you see in some of the movies. They also didn't wear red sashes. More on that in just a bit. Truth be told, they were just a loose confederation of ranch hands, and in some cases outright bandits, some of whom had also ridden with John Kinney, who just routinely banded together when they conducted raids down in Mexico. Not only were they successful in making off with a ton of stolen cattle, as well as silver, but they also weren't afraid of using deadly force. Like in July of 1879 when they went on a killing spree in Sonora. And then when the Mexican authorities rode out in pursuit, the Cowboys set up an ambush and killed all of them but 3. This would be repeated just 2 years later, in July of 81, following yet another raid down in Sonora. Once again, they were followed, and once again, the Cowboys sprung an ambush, killing at least 8 of their pursuers. Following day, another bunch of cowboys, including Old Man Clanton, ambushed a caravan of Mexican smugglers nearby Skull Canyon, killing at least 4 and making off with several $1,000s worth of silver and livestock. And this probably was not the only time they pulled off such a dastardly attack. Matter of fact, just days prior, another caravan, comprised of over a dozen smugglers, completely disappeared on their way from Sonora to Silver City. Apparently, smuggling was a pretty big business along that stretch of the border, and since the victims were themselves operating outside the law, they really weren't all that fired up to go run into the authorities. So a lot of this stuff just got swept under the rug. Or at least it did until these most recent depredations. To quote historian John Bozenecker, the survivors of the Skull Canyon ambush rode south some 80 miles to Fronteras. Quote, they reported the raid and the murder of their 4 comrades. The news of a dozen murders and 2 attacks outraged Mexican authorities. As General Dominguez explained to the editor of the Tombstone Epitaph a few weeks later, our people have been great sufferers. We have lost many citizens killed and much property stolen. We are therefore taking active steps to protect our citizens and repel raiders. End of quote. And yeah, to say that they took active steps is a wee bit of an understatement. Just a few weeks later, on August 13th, Old Man Clanton and 6 of his buddies were right back at the scene of the crime with around 75 head of what were almost certainly stolen Mexican cattle. Clanton had just woken up and was in the process of rousing the others when all hell broke loose. According to Mark Lee Gardner, in his new book, Brothers of the Gun, quote, Clanton had just crawled out of bed and called to the other men to get moving when a hail of bullets ripped into the camp, the echo of the gunfire reverberating between the low hills. Puffs of black powder smoke from as many as 50 guns floated over the ridges directly above the camp. Behind those guns were Mexican soldiers, and they weren't there to take prisoners. And yeah, Old Man Clanton and his entire party, except for just 2 men, were shot dead. Hell, one of the cowboys didn't even make it out of his blankets. And I guess the rest is history. The Cowboys wisely began doing most of the robbing north of the border, and then, just 2.5 months later, is when they squared off against the Earps and Doc Holliday in what will forever be remembered as the gunfight at the OK Corral. Now, what you just heard was my very humble attempt at answering a question from listener Krabby Trucker, who asked the following. I watched Tombstone with my dad back in the day. He told me Old Man Clanton was a real mean bastard. Who was Old Man Clanton? I asked. Dad said that he was the boss who wasn't in the movie. Anyway, I was young and Dad passed, so my dumb young question was all there was. Josh, do you know about the real cowboys with red sashes? Old Man Clanton, or anything else the movie left out? Well, thank you, Krabby, and my sincere condolences about your father's passing. Sounds to me like he was pretty much on the mark, though. I don't know whether or not Old Man Clanton was an official boss, but he was definitely a very rough customer. As far as the red sashes, I did sort of touch on this earlier, but unfortunately, the answer is no. As cool as it looked in the movie, the cowboys there in Tombstone did not wear red sashes. I actually reached out to my buddy David Lambert. He's my go-to expert on all things Western movie related. And from what he sent me, it does appear as if the screenwriter for Tombstone, Kevin Jarre, got his inspiration from Wild Bill Hickok. Wild Bill, of course, was known to wear sashes. But then again, he certainly wasn't the only one. You can find a lot of photos from that same time period of other people wearing very similar get-ups. It's also worth noting that there was another gang of rustlers up in Wyoming in the 1890s known as the Red Sash Gang. I don't have a ton of information about these guys. I've only read a little bit in passing, so I don't know if the sashes were something that they all wore or if it was just their name for some other reason. But yeah, long story short, while there's no historical evidence that the Cochise County Cowboys wore red sashes, at least as far as I'm aware, it also wasn't unheard of. It's period accurate, if not necessarily tombstone accurate, if that makes any sense. Thanks again for the question, and if the rest of you don't mind, I will go ahead and answer a few more listener-submitted questions and comments. Sort of like I did a couple weeks ago. If you missed that episode, go ahead and check it out. It's the one where I spoke about the beginning and the end of the Old West. But I had a lot of fun, so I figured why not go for a repeat. Okay, so next up, we've got Pickett, It Will Never Heal, with another tombstone-related question. Which do you prefer and why? Kurt Russell's Tombstone or Kevin Costner's Wyatt Earp? You know, this is probably going to sound like a cop-out, but I like them both. I'm probably going to give the slight edge to Tombstone just because A, it is a great first Western if you're trying to introduce somebody new to the genre, and B, it is very, very quotable. I've heard Mark Lee Gardner, who we referenced earlier, I've heard him say the same thing twice now in a couple of interviews, and I 100% agree. Other than maybe Lonesome Dove, I can't think of a single Western that people quote more often than Tombstone. Hell, I probably quote it myself on a weekly basis. Especially that line from Billy Bob Thornton. Remember when he was playing poker? Like if I'm stuck in traffic or someone's really starting to irritate me, I'll let loose with a Christ almighty. It's like I'm sitting here playing cards with my brother's kids or something. You nerve-wracking sons of bitches. And that's just one of the many great lines, right? I mean, just Val Kilmer alone makes it one of the most quotable movies of all time. But then again, in Costner's Wyatt Earp, we get to see more of a backstory, right? You see Wyatt Earp running away from home, becoming a buffalo hunter, and even meeting Doc Holliday for the first time. So yeah, to answer your question, I do enjoy them both. Maybe a slight edge to Tombstone. And they do both have flaws, by the way, when it comes to historical accuracy. But that's just sort of par for the course. As far as entertainment goes, I give them both 2 thumbs up. Coming in next is Skyzak over on Spotify. Can you do a deep dive into the history of the Fort Worth stockyards within the timeline of the Wild West? Yeah, I could probably do an episode on the Fort Worth stockyards one of these days. I'll tell you this much though, and I know you didn't ask. The only reason I'm bringing this up is because a lot of people just aren't really aware of it. But historically speaking, the stockyards were just where the cowboys dropped off their herds. And then once all the work was done, that's when they'd ride into the actual city of Fort Worth to get their drink on. All of the saloons and gambling halls, the so-called red light district, all of that was located in what's now downtown Fort Worth, as opposed to the stockyards, including the White Elephant. I know there's currently a White Elephant saloon right there in the stockyards, but that is not the original location, and it's also not where Luke Short got into that famous gunfight. Like I said, I'm just bringing this up in case anyone wasn't already aware. I know that area can get a little touristy, but yeah, I think a history on the stockyards might just make for an interesting episode. So thank you, Zach, for the suggestion. Okay, got a few good Billy the Kid comments this week. The first coming from listener Shane on YouTube. I love how this dude acts like Garrett, who was sheriff in the 1800s Wild West, wouldn't force, threaten, or cohorts, I think he means coerce, those there that night to corroborate his story. He had everything to lose and gain by doing so. 1, the reward money, and 2, if it was the wrong guy, how embarrassing. And he would have lost his job and been imprisoned, and it's known dude was a liar and a traitor, so nah, I don't think he killed Billy the Kid. I like this dude and his channel, but you're just reciting the same facts that we all have access to, which is the fake info they make known or had made known at the time. The whole era was corrupt. Garrett did not kill Billy the Kid. Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for the compliment. But as far as Garrett threatening or coercing the citizens of Fort Sumner, if that's the case, then why didn't they speak up after Garrett's death in 1908? Especially considering that many of them were still alive in the 1940s. So I don't know, man. I kind of feel like if they were all threatened, that at least one of them would have come forward at some point and stated the truth, if that was really the case. And this whole idea that if Garrett killed the wrong man, he would have been sent to prison. I've heard a lot of other people say the exact same thing, and I'm going to be honest here. I promise I'm not trying to be a dick, but I just don't understand the logic. Let's go ahead and just think it through, okay? Let's pretend that Garrett did shoot the wrong man, some random Mexican, like a lot of people claim, thinking that it was Billy the Kid, only to then inspect the body and discover that he messed up. I don't know if you're aware of this or not, but sheriffs killing random Mexicans in the Old West wasn't exactly a rare phenomenon, and they almost never got in trouble for it. I mean, hell, the Texas Rangers massacred a ton of innocent Hispanics as recently as the 1910s. And when I say a ton, estimates vary, but it was somewhere between the hundreds all the way up to the thousands. And not a single person was held accountable. So I don't really know why you think it would be any different in New Mexico in the 1880s. We also know that Garrett wouldn't have gone to prison for killing the wrong man because he had done just that very thing several months prior when he shot Charlie Bowdry. And as far as I know, he wasn't even reprimanded. And by the way, if he really did shoot the wrong guy and he was worried about getting in trouble, all he had to do was claim self-defense. I mean, what's easier, planting a pistol on your victim or threatening hundreds of people and lying to the entirety of the Santa Fe ring in the hopes that a very young bandit would never again resurface? And then on top of all of that, being gullible enough to think that none of the many, many eyewitnesses would ever spill the beans. It just logically and logistically makes zero sense. And look, I know I said this recently. I'll go ahead and repeat myself. I'm not trying to change anyone's mind regarding Billy's death. If you want to believe that he escaped and lived to be an old man, far be it from me to rain on your parade. That's not what I'm trying to do. All I'm doing is sharing the historical evidence. And as things currently stand, despite any of our personal feelings regarding Pat Garrett, there is simply no evidence whatsoever that Billy escaped death at Fort Sumner. Okay, next we've got listener Keith, who wants to know what happened to Billy's guns. So where are Billy the Kid's guns? Pat Garrett claimed he shot Billy in self-defense. Does that mean Pat Garrett was attacked by an unarmed man? Strange no weapon belonging to Billy the Kid was taken by Pat Garrett. Now, this is another question I've gotten more than a few times, and believe it or not, we do have information concerning the fate of the pistol. There's actually a document dated October 3rd, 1881, signed by Garrett himself and filed with the Lincoln County Commissioner's Office that reads the following, quote, I have in my possession 2 horses and 1 saddle captured from Frank Wheeler. Also 1 gun and 6-shooter captured off William Bonney, which awaits your orders. By the way, shout out to Ben Doss for providing me with a copy of said document. And just in case anyone's going to try to say that it's a fake, I did reach out to the county clerk's office over in Carrizozo, and they were able to send me a copy of the original. Now, this is also backed up by noted frontier detective Charlie Siringo in his book, The History of Billy the Kid. Quote, during the following spring in the town of Lincoln, the sheriff auctioned off the kid's saddle and the blue barrel, rubber-handed, double-action Colt's .41 caliber pistol, which the kid held in his hand when he was killed. There were only 2 bidders for the pistol, the rider and the deputy county clerk, Billy Burt, who got it for $13.50. Its actual value was about $12. End of quote. So yeah, according to both Charlie Siringo and official documentation, the pistol was sold about a year or so after the kid's death. Where it is now, or what happened to it afterwards, I have absolutely no idea. I wish I did, but I don't. Great question, though. Okay, next, we have the real Kevin, who asks, do we really know that the picture of Billy the Kid is really him? What if there were a whole bunch of pictures of him that nobody recognizes because the old tintype was of someone else? Well, Kevin, we do know with relative certainty that the tintype depicts Billy the Kid, and we know this due to provenance, or a claim of ownership. Now, there were initially 4 identical images, all taken at the same time, right there at Fort Sumner, and I don't fully understand the tintype taking process. I don't know all the lingo or the proper terms, but these 4 images were all developed onto a single thin piece of metal. And then they were separated into 4 identical tintypes, all about the size of a credit card. And by the way, I don't know why I keep doing this with my hand. I don't know what to do with my hands. What was that from? Talladega Nights, right? Yeah, I too do not know what to do with my hands. Anyway, so these tintypes, right? There were 4 of them. We know that Billy gave 1 to his good friend Dan Diedrich. And then later on, Diedrich gave it to his nephew Frank Upham. It remained with the Upham family until the 1980s when they loaned it out to the Lincoln County Heritage Trust. And then in 2011 is when they sold it at auction for over $2 million. So in other words, we know who owned the tintype literally from the moment it left Billy's hands all the way up until it was sold at auction. As far as the other three, Billy gave one of them to Delvina Maxwell, but sadly it was lost in a house fire a few years later. And the third photo somehow came into the possession of the Illustrated Police News. Believe it or not, they actually printed the photograph while Billy was still alive. How they got their hands on it, though, remains a mystery. But then again, this is also when Billy was in custody, so I do think it's likely that a guard took it off of him, or possibly even a deputy, and they were the ones that either gave or sold it to the Illustrated Police News. And finally, the last of the 4 images was obtained by none other than Patrick Floyd Garrett. Once again, we don't know how he got it, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably after he arrested the kid at Stinking Springs, or maybe even after he killed him over at Fort Sumner. Now, Garrett was quoted in a newspaper in 1902 saying that he still had the tintype, but much like the one that was given to the Police News, nobody knows what became of it. Maybe they were destroyed or lost, or who knows, maybe they're still out there somewhere, just awaiting to be discovered. Take that as a reminder to go check out some of the boxes up in your grandma's attic. Never know what's in there. As things currently stand, though, the only known surviving tintype is the one that I mentioned earlier, the Diedrich tintype that was sold at auction. But wait, there's more. We also have additional proof from Billy's alleged girlfriend, Pauletta Maxwell. Apparently, she was not a fan, stating, quote, "I never liked the picture. I don't think it does Billy justice. It makes him look rough and uncouth. The expression of his face was really boyish and very pleasant. He may have worn such clothes out on the range, but in Fort Sumner, he was careful of his appearance and dressed neatly and in good taste." So yeah, until someone invents a time machine and we can witness the photo being taken with our own 2 eyes, that's about as good as it can possibly get as far as proof or provenance. Okay, next we got Kazzy, keeping things short and sweet by asking, "Bro, what happened to the intro?" Now, this is more of a YouTube-related question, as the intro can still be heard on other platforms like Spotify and Apple and everywhere else other than YouTube. But really, this was just a strategic decision made on my part, basically just to help maximize reach. Some of you may not remember this, but back in the day, I'm talking like circa 2010, it seemed like everybody on YouTube had these really long songs for their intros. Not clips, but full-length songs. So you either had to skip the first several minutes or just sit there and twiddle your thumbs until the music was over. Nobody's really doing that anymore, and the reason is, number one, it's annoying for the viewers, and number two, it absolutely kills engagement. Even with short intros like mine. You know, people get bored, and rather than just skip ahead a few seconds, they click off to the next video. And if that happens enough, then the algorithm just assumes that nobody's interested and it stops recommending your content. Now, in my case, the intro was just around 12 seconds, which doesn't seem like a long time, but you gotta remember, this is 2025, it's almost 2026, and our attention spans have been absolutely fried by the internet. So nowadays, unfortunately, 12 seconds can feel like an eternity when you're doing something online. And look, I actually do have access to my own internal analytics, so I am able to see when engagement starts to drop off. And as crazy as it sounds, those 12 seconds were affecting my average view duration. Like I said, though, this is just on YouTube. If you listen to the podcast literally anywhere else, you'll still be able to hear the intro at the beginning and the full song at the end. I'd prefer to keep it on every platform. I really like the intro. I think it fits the show perfectly. And I also don't think it's gone forever. This is just something I'm trying out for now. We'll see how it works out, and we will adjust from there. But yeah, that is the current situation regarding Introgate 2025. This next one comes from Gamma with a very nice compliment, as well as an interesting question. "I've learned more from you than all of my history classes put together. I've always wondered how the Oklahoma Panhandle has come to be. Did you do a video on it?" Well, thank you, Gamma, and I very much appreciate that. But no, I have not done anything on the Oklahoma Panhandle, but oddly enough, I was just reading about this exact topic a few weeks ago, and a lot of people aren't going to like this, but it all comes down to that dreaded S word, slavery. Okay, so the land that became the Oklahoma Panhandle was originally part of the Republic of Texas. I know I've spoken about the Missouri Compromise on previous episodes, but this is relevant, so let me just give a very quick summary. It was basically a piece of legislation passed in 1820 that prohibited slavery in what remained of the Louisiana Purchase lands north of the 3630 parallel, except for Missouri, hence the compromise. This was just a way of trying to balance out the northern states that wanted to abolish slavery and the southern states who wanted to expand it. Now, if you take a map and draw a line from the border between Arkansas and Missouri, you connect it to what's now the northern border of the Texas Panhandle, all the way west to California. That line is the 3630 parallel. So when Texas sought to enter the Union as a slave state, they were told by Congress that any territory north of that line, like what's now the Oklahoma Panhandle, would not be able to be admitted as slave soil. In other words, they'd have to give it up. This was formalized a few years later with the Compromise of 1850, and that was that. The abandoned strip eventually became sort of a no man's land and remained completely ungoverned for quite a while until it was eventually opened up for settlement. I think in 1890, but you might want to double check me on that one. Was there more involved? Of course there was. This is history we're talking about. Things are never just that cut and dry. For instance, the Compromise of 1850 did not just apply only to the Panhandle. It also reset all of Texas's northern and western boundaries. Then there's the fact that Texas never really fully controlled that area to begin with, and there was a lot of money involved. I think Texas ended up getting around $10 million for all that ceded land. There's also an argument to be made that the Missouri Compromise didn't really matter on account of Texas never being part of the Louisiana Purchase, which is technically true. But then again, it's also true that Congress had full authority to impose the terms of admission on new states, and they did explicitly require adherence to the 3630 parallel. So yeah, as always, history is complicated, but at the most basic level, slavery is the direct reason why the Oklahoma Panhandle exists in its current form. Hope that answered your question, and I look forward to receiving all of the many comments and emails telling me that I am a cuck for mentioning slavery or acknowledging that slavery ever existed. Okay, speaking of criticism, we got a little bit of criticism from listener Clancy over on YouTube. He's not very happy with the way I talk. You must be from the East Coast. A lot of the names and places you pronounce wrong, and it sounds like you were trying too hard to be hip. Well, Clancy, I don't know what to tell you, bro. I was born in Texas. I've lived in Texas my entire life, and I currently reside in Texas. Believe it or not, I have never been further east than Lake Charles, Louisiana. True story. You know, it's really interesting because there's so many names and places that you would never intuitively know how to say properly unless you had either lived there at some point or you visited and spent time with the locals. Great example of this here in Texas. There's a street in Houston called Kirkendall. My brothers and sisters in Christ, there is no R in the word Kirkendall. And you would never know how to say it properly unless you've ever been to Houston, or maybe you spent time with someone who was in Houston and they told you about it. There is no way someone looks at that word with zero context and says, hey, you know what? I bet that Y is pronounced R. As far as me pronouncing stuff wrong, though, I do honestly make an effort, much more of an effort nowadays than I used to, but I do make an effort to get the correct pronunciation, but there's always going to be stuff that slips under the radar. Does that mean I'm from the East Coast, or does that mean that just the way words are pronounced can oftentimes be complicated and influenced by local culture? You tell me. So, Clancy, I'm sorry if I let you down, buddy, for the way I talk or for being too hip. These things just happen, but I do promise I'll try to be a good boy from now on. Okay? Last but certainly not least, we got the one and only Bobby Six Gun chiming in with a somewhat explosive comment. Found out today at 62, you cannot trust a fart. Well, you know what, Bobby? I'm not quite at that age yet, but I did have a very severe case of food poisoning about a week ago. And yeah, I totally get it, man. Not only could I not trust a fart, but sneezing, standing. Hell, at one point, I thought if I blinked too hard, I might have a situation on my hands. And on top of all of that, my daughter came down with a pretty nasty case of the strep throat. Suffice it to say, I've been pretty much out of commission for over a week now, which brings me to my closing statement. I know I said recently I'd be dropping a new episode on Doc Holliday, and then we'd go ahead and start on the Wyatt Earp series. But with this most recent setback, as well as the fact that Christmas and New Year's are just literally right around the corner, I think I'm going to make a slight adjustment to the upcoming schedule. And look, I know the holidays can be a very busy time. Let's face it, you've got better things to do than sit around and listen to me talk. You're going to be hanging out with your family, hopefully eating good food, maybe watching a little football. And rather than Doc and Wyatt Earp getting lost in all that Yuletide chaos, I think the best course of action would just be to wait until after January 1st. It's not that big of a delay, just a couple of weeks, and I will be uploading another new episode, very similar to this one, next Wednesday. All right, and I guess that's about all I've got. Until next time, adios.